Hey, Doc Squad, Dr. White here with the Business Analysis Doctor. Today, I'm giving a detailed tutorial on creating a well-crafted software requirement specification. But before we get started, if you want more business analysis training and tips, be sure to subscribe to the page and turn on that notification bell. With that said, let's get started. Let's talk about what you'll learn. First, we'll look at what a software requirement specification, or SRS, is. Then we'll look at functional and non-functional requirements. We'll discuss the primary SRS audience, the main components of an SRS, software requirement specification best practices, and then we'll look at an example of a software requirement specification. So what is a software requirement specification? This is a formal business analyst document that describes the behavior and implication of a software application by outlining functional and non-functional requirements. Functional requirements are statements that describe the solution capabilities and behavior under specific conditions. They also describe the information that the solution will handle. Functional requirements are developed by decomposing stakeholder requirements down to the various system requirements that will enable it. Non-functional requirements describes the performance or quality characteristics a solution must have to be effective and of adequate satisfaction to the stakeholders. These requirements are usually measurable and form constraints on the solution. Non-functional requirements generally apply to the entire solution or system rather than a single functionality. Software requirements are used to provide a detailed description of solution requirements. It serves as a blueprint for design and implementation by the technical team. It's also used as a communication tool between technical and business stakeholders. So who is the SRS for? The primary audience of the SRS includes the following. The technical team will use the software requirement specification as a guide to develop solution designs and to build and implement the software solution. Properly decomposed functional requirements should provide enough detail for developers to unit test the code during development. The subject matter expert, or SME, will be responsible for reviewing the SRS for accuracy and completeness. While other roles may be involved in approving the SRS, they often rely on the SME's knowledge for approval. Testing teams. The quality assurance and user acceptance testing teams will use the SRS as an outline for developing test cases. These teams will also help ensure that the requirements are testable during requirements review sessions. While the structure of the software requirement specification varies based on the needs of the organization and project, the most common sections of the SRS includes introduction, overall description, business rules, functional requirements, use cases, data requirements, external requirements, non-functional requirements, reporting requirements, and supplemental information. Now let's look at each section in detail. The Software Requirement Specification Introduction provides an overview of the initiative and the document. Two key components of the introduction include the purpose and the project scope. The purpose describes the purpose of the SRS, identifies the product for which it is created, and describes the intended audience for the document. The project scope gives an overview of the software that's specified in the document in relation to the general business requirements, including the business goals, objectives, and expected outcomes. Now let's look at the overall description of the SRS. This section provides a high-level overview of the product and describes the general functionality of the software. It also describes the users of the software, the operating environment, as well as any constraints, dependencies, and assumptions that apply to the software. The product perspective description describes the origin of the product or solution within the context of the organization. For example, is it replacing or enhancing an existing system, or is it a brand new product? It also describes the key interfaces between the solution and the larger system that it may be a part of. A system context diagram is often helpful to illustrate this. User classes is a description of the characteristics, needs, and expectations of the users who will be using and directly interacting with software. This section will be a subset of the project stakeholders. The operating environment describes the environment the software will operate in, such as operating systems, system version, databases, hosts, servers, and geographical locations of the users. Constraints are the influencing factors that cannot be changed and often create limitations or restrictions on the product or solution. Assumptions are influencing factors that are considered to be true but has not been verified. There are also conditions that are true now but may not be true in the future. These assumptions are confirmed or disproven before making any decisions that they may impact. Dependencies are components of the solution that depend on the completion of the internal or external project factors. Common dependencies may be the implementation of requirements that are dependent on other requirements, decisions to be made, resources, funding, or other constraints. The SRS may include additional constraints, assumptions, and dependencies that were not defined in the BRD as a result of being discovered during requirement analysis. The next section is Software Requirements Business Rules. A business rule is a specific, testable, and business-driven directive that guides behavior, judgment, or decision-making. Business rules generally emerge as constraints in the form of policies, guidelines, standards, regulations, or calculated formulas. This section includes a list of business rules that impact the software, a description of the business rule, and an indication of the related requirement that's impacted by the rule. This is often illustrated with a table or matrix. The next section of the SRS is the functional requirements. This is arguably the most important section of the document, and it outlines what the system is supposed to do and what task it should perform. There are various ways to present the functional requirements. However, one best practice is to start with the stakeholder requirements the functional requirement is derived from, and then decompose it into functional specifications. Other approaches start with features or business rule that drives the specification. The structure of a functional requirement should include the actor, which will always be the system, the action, which is a verb, the object, which is a noun, and the qualifier criteria if needed. A key note about functional requirements is that they should generally be system agnostic to minimize the design dependency on a specific application. This is why we use the system. Now let's look at SRS use cases. A use case is a functionality in a system that will allow the user to achieve a goal. A use case description is a narrative that describes the relationship between actors and the solution, as well as the details of how the interaction works. There may be times when the functional requirements involve various scenarios that impact the outcome of the functionality. Use case diagrams and use case description may be included to outline these scenarios in detail. The main components of the use case diagram includes the system name, the system boundary box, actors, use cases, associations, relationships, and goals. The main components of a use case description includes the use case name, the associated functional requirement, actors, preconditions, triggers, postconditions, flow of events, and scenarios. For detailed tutorials on both of these use case techniques, see the links in the description. Next is the Software Requirement Specification data requirements. This section describes the data that the software needs to handle, store, and manipulate to perform its functions. The data that the system will consume, process, and create will be outlined here. Common elements of this section may include a logical data model, a data dictionary, and the data acquisition and maintenance. A data model is a visual representation of the solution system's data relationships. It may be included in the SRS to provide a high-level overview of the system's data. A logical entity relationship diagram, or ERD, is commonly used for this purpose. For a detailed tutorial on the ERD, see the link in the description. The data dictionary is a list of important business terms with detailed information or metadata about each of them. This often includes a description of the business term, data types, allowed values, and any other information that needs to have an acceptable level of consistency to be useful. While the data model provides a high-level overview of the system's data, the data dictionary provides a detailed view. For more information on the data dictionary, see the link in the description. Data maintenance describes how data is received and maintained within the solution. This may include how often data is transitioned and updated, how long it's retained, data verification protocols, archive cycles, backup procedures, data disposal timeframes, etc. The external requirements in an SRS describes the requirements that are outside or external to the solution itself, but will interact with it to enable it to function properly. Key external interfaces are user interface, software interface, and communications interface. User interfaces specify each user interface within the solution, including how users will interact with the system, the screens they will use, their navigation experience, what type of user inputs are expected, and the expected response or outputs the solution will provide. Software interfaces describe the interfaces between the solution being specified and other software applications or components such as operating systems, databases, web services, or commercial integrated systems. Communication interfaces define the communication channels and formats required for the solution to communicate with other systems, including networks, emails, messaging systems, and other communication interfaces. The next section of the software requirement specification is non-functional requirements, or NFRs, which we defined earlier in the lesson. There are various categories of non-functional requirements. Here are some of the most common NFRs. Availability is the extent to which the solution is accessible and operating when needed. This is often expressed in terms of the percentage of time the system is available. Compatibility is the degree to which the solution operates effectively with other components in its environment, such as one process with another. Performance is the speed at which the solution performs its function and responds to other inputs with minimum consumption of resources. Portability is the ease with which the solution can be transferred from one operating environment to another. Reliability is the extent to which a solution is available and performance required functions under stated conditions before failing. Scalability is the degree to which a solution can grow or handle increased workloads. Security is how well the solution protects against unauthorized use, modifications, destruction, or disclosure. Supportability is how easy the solution is to install, configure, and maintain, and the adequacy of supporting and training documentation. Usability is the ease of which the user can learn to use and navigate through the solution. Localization are the requirements related to local languages, laws, currencies, cultures, and other geographically driven user characteristics. Next is the SRS reporting requirements. These requirements outline the reports that will be generated by the solution if applicable. This includes type of reports, inputs, layouts, logic, sequencing, etc. The following are the common elements of reporting requirements. The description provides general information about each report, including report title, purpose, users, and data resources. The header and footer provides specifications about the layout and printout of the report's header and footer sections that apply to all reports listed further down. The layout outlines the body of the report, such as fields, column and row names, charts and graphs, etc. A wireframe of the report would be helpful here as well. Security and access describes who can access the report and outlines any limitations among the various user groups. Report logic specifies the general logic of the report, such as triggers, rules, calculations, latency, and any criteria that impacts the report generation. Now let's look at the supporting sections of the software requirement specification. These are the additional sections that provide additional context, background information, or supporting details that are relevant to the functional and non-functional requirement. These sections can vary based on project and organization. Common supporting sections that may be included in the SRS are as follows. The glossary of term provides a common understanding of the terms that are used in the software requirement specification. This is especially critical when a term may have different meanings for different stakeholders, or if there are acronyms that need to be defined for the stakeholders who may not be familiar with them. The appendix includes any attachments or links to additional information outside of the actual SRS that are relevant to the project, such as diagrams, charts, or tables. And finally is the approvers and sign-off section. This section includes the signatures of all stakeholders with decision-making authority to indicate their approval of the software requirement specification. Sign-off ensures that all stakeholders are in agreement with the requirements outlined in the document. By obtaining the signatures from the key stakeholders, the project team can confirm that everyone is aligned and committed to the specification. At this point, the SRS is ready to be used to guide development work and testing efforts. Now let's look at some best practices for creating a complete and effective software requirement specification. Create a separate business requirements document. A separate business requirements document should be developed and approved before formulating the SRS. This helps the business analyst ensure that all stakeholders agree on the scope and expected outcomes before spending time analyzing detailed requirement. Involve key stakeholders. Involve all the relevant stakeholders in the process of developing the software requirement specification. This includes subject matter experts who may be involved in outlining the use cases, developers who may assist in ensuring the requirements are properly decomposed, or testers who can help ensure that the requirements are testable. By doing this, you can ensure that everyone's needs are met and that the SRS is fit for purpose. Enable manageability. Structure the requirements in a way that makes it easy to change and update them without excessive impact to other components of the SRS. Also, ensure each proposed change can be traced to an existing requirement. This is often facilitated with a traceability matrix. Use a checklist. A requirements checklist helps the business analyst ensure that all necessary criteria and quality standards are met for each functional and non-functional requirement, as well as the overall specification document. Use visuals. Use diagrams, flowcharts, and other visual aids to illustrate complex requirements or processes within the SRS. This will add clarity and ensure that all stakeholders have a shared understanding. Be clear. Business analysts need to use clear and concise language to express requirements in the software requirement specification. Avoid jargon and ambiguity and be specific about what the software should do and achieve. Use diagrams and examples to help clarify the requirements. Now let's take a look at an example software requirement specification. This is a project for the admissions department website for a university. To start, you would just include the name of the project, the version number, date, and I usually like to include the company logo on the document as well. Then we have a revision history where you include any changes that are made to the document as they're reviewed. Next is a typical table of contents. The first section is the introduction section. I've highlighted some key areas of the purpose and project scope. So for the purpose, we have this software requirement specification outlines the functional and non-functional requirements for Release 1.0 of the Admissions Department website or ADW project. The project scope says that the Admissions Department website will transition all applications and forms to an online platform and establish an electronic user account for the website. The next section is the overall description. For the description, we have that the ADW project is an enhancement to the existing Department of Education website that will transition many of the administrative services. The context diagram below illustrates the system interfaces and external entities. For the user class section, we describe the users. So for example, a student can either be an active student or a prospective student. The admission staff will have a passive interaction with the system, and the administrator is responsible for managing and maintaining the website. Next is the operating environment. Here I'm saying that the website must operate correctly with the most updated versions of the following web browsers: Windows Internet Explorer, Firefox, Google Chrome, and Safari. For design and implementation constraints, one of the specifications is that the system must pull student information from current university databases. Next is the assumptions, which is that the website must be available 24/7 outside of scheduled maintenance. For dependencies, I have that all applicable forms will need to be transitioned to an online format before implementation. The next section is the business rules. As you can see, we have a business rule list, which outlines the rule ID, the rule definition, the type, and impacted area. So for admission 1, the business rule here is that the student must have a minimum high school GPA of 2.7 on a 4.0 grading scale. And the business rule type is eligibility. The impacted requirement is requirement 4.8 FR. Next is the functional requirements section. This is where you should probably be spending the most amount of time. As you can see here, I have the functional requirements grouped by users. So I have a student user group, and an admission staff user group. So here I'm breaking down all of the stakeholder requirements from the BRD into functional requirements. So the stakeholder requirement here is that the student must be able to schedule an appointment based on available days and time. Here, I'm breaking down the functional requirements for this stakeholder requirement. So the functional requirement here states that the system must display a calendar of available dates when the student selects schedule from the appointment options. Another example is that the system must display available time slots when the student selects any date from the calendar of available dates. Now let's move on to the use case section. When there are functional requirements that need to be described in more detail or have various scenarios that need to be discussed, you can incorporate use cases to represent the additional details that are needed. I'm outlining the various scenarios that are related to the list of requirements above, so I'm referencing them here. This use case includes the main path, an alternate flow, and the exception flow. You can include as many use cases you need in the specification. The next section is the data requirements. Here, I'm using an entity relationship diagram and a data dictionary to represent all of the key data elements for this project. So now we have the data maintenance requirements. So one example I have here is that the website must retain student appointment history for up to 365 days. Next, we have the external requirements. For user interface, one of the requirements is that the system must provide an FAQ section on each web page with common questions. For software requirements, I have sections including the admissions portal, the department portal, and the student portal. So for the admission portal, one of the requirements is that the system must transmit all online course enrollments to the admission portal immediately to keep course availability up to date. For communication interfaces, one requirement might be that the system must send an email message to the student to confirm appointments scheduled online. So now we have our non-functional requirements. Some of the NFRs that I've included are availability requirements, capability, compatibility requirements, reliability requirements, scalability requirements, and localization. So for availability requirement, you might have that the system must be available 99% of the time outside of scheduled maintenance. For compatibility, I've got that the system must be compatible with different operating systems such as Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and mobile operating systems like iOS and Android. A reliability requirement might be that the system must install any available software update nightly to remain up to date. For scalability, the system must be able to handle a large amount of volume of concurrent users without affecting performance or availability. And for localization, a requirement might be that the system must support local date and time formats that are commonly used in the student's country or region. Now we have the reporting requirements section. Some templates may include reporting requirements as part of the data requirements, but I like to keep them separate at the end because sometimes these requirements are implemented much later than the actual solution. So for each report, you'll have a list of requirements including report title, headers and footers, specification rules and conditions, field order, grouping, totaling, and maybe a sample. So for the report title, I would just say the report title is student enrollments report. So for headers and footers, I would say that the report header must contain the report title, patron's name, and the date range specified. For special rules and conditions, I might have that the report must receive a date range input to generate results. For special rules and conditions, I'd specify that the report must receive a date range input to generate results. For field order, I'd specify that the fields should be in the following order, including student ID, student name, enrollment date, and student department. For grouping, I'd specify that the report must allow for grouping by department. For totaling, I might specify that the report must total the number of enrollments based on all enrollments or filtered enrollments. And generally, a sample report will be helpful. You could include it here, or you could include it as a part of the appendix. So for glossary of terms, I might have a list of terms here. So for example, a prospective student is anyone who needs services related to the Department of Education, but has not been admitted into the university. For the appendix, I might have several attachments, including the BRD, the current state process map, future state process maps, the data dictionary, or maybe the report samples. And then finally, I would have my approvals and sign off. And of course, these would be our decision-making stakeholders for the project. And once we get sign off, the software requirement specification will serve as the blueprint for our design discussions and documentation, as well as a baseline for any requirement changes. Well, there you have it, folks. That's what you need to know to craft a well-defined software requirement specification. If you learned something new, be sure to tell me about it in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. Also, be sure to check out all of the business analysis and certification training we have for you available at thebadoc.com. Thank you so much for watching. Have a productive and prosperous day, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.